On February 14, 1943, high above Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, Japanese naval aviation faced a turning point it could not have anticipated. At 18,000 feet, the elite pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy encountered an aircraft that would not only challenge their dominance, but systematically dismantle it over the coming months. That aircraft was the chance-vought F4U Corsair. Painted in a deep navy blue, with its unmistakable inverted gull wings and massive four-bladed propeller, the Corsair represented a new era of aerial warfare. What unfolded on that Valentine's Day was far more than another clash between American and Japanese forces. It marked the beginning of a psychological and technological shift that would eventually unravel the confidence of Japan's most seasoned aviators. Until that day, the Mitsubishi A6M0 had been the undisputed king of the Pacific skies. Light, nimble, and capable of out-turning any Allied aircraft, the Zero had dominated opponents from the attack on Pearl Harbor to sweeping victories across Southeast Asia. Japanese pilots, many of whom had accumulated over 800 flight hours by 1943, and in some cases more than 2,000, were graduates of the grueling Yokaran training system. Only a small fraction of applicants survived this program, and those who did were forged into highly skilled warriors. Their victories in China, Burma, and the Philippines reinforced the belief that their aircraft and doctrine were unmatched. The Zero's ability to outmaneuver opponents had created an aura of invincibility. But when the Corsair entered combat, that perception began to collapse. During the first engagement, Corsairs escorted American PB-4, WWII Liberators on a strike against the Japanese airfield at Kahili. The results were costly for the Americans. 9 aircraft were lost for the destruction of only a single Zero, but the encounter revealed something profoundly unsettling to Japanese pilots. These new American fighters refused to play by the established rules of dogfighting. They did not attempt to outturn the Zeros. Instead, they climbed higher, dove faster, and attacked with crushing speed before zooming back to altitudes the Japanese could not reach. For the first time, Japanese aviators realized they were up against an opponent whose technical superiority reshaped the very dynamics of aerial combat. The Corsair's capabilities stunned them. Powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2008 100 double Wasp engine, producing over 2,000 horsepower, the aircraft could reach speeds above 400 miles per hour, far beyond what the Zero could manage. In diving attacks, Corsairs approached terrifying speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, while Zeros risked catastrophic structural failure if pushed beyond 410. Even in climb performance, the disparity was unmistakable. The Corsair could ascend to 20,000 feet in just over 7 minutes, while the Zero took nearly 11. Above 25,000 feet, where the Corsair remained agile and powerful, the Zero became sluggish and nearly uncontrollable. This was not simply a contest of pilots, but a contest of machines. The Corsair embodied a different philosophy of war. Unlike the Zero, which sacrificed protection for maneuverability, the Corsair was armored, equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks, and carried 6 .50-caliber Browning machine guns capable of unleashing devastating firepower. Cannon shells that would destroy a Zero barely scratched the Corsair, which often returned to base riddled with holes but still flyable. For Japanese pilots who had believed skill and spirit could overcome material disadvantage, the Corsair was a terrifying revelation. Their supremacy in the Pacific was not merely being challenged, it was being dismantled before their eyes. To understand why the F4U Corsair struck such fear into Japanese aviators, it is essential to first examine the mindset of those who faced it. By early 1943, the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy were not merely experienced. They were among the most elite airmen the world had ever produced. Their training system was brutal in its selectivity and unforgiving in its methods. The Yokaran Naval Aviator Preparatory Course admitted fewer than 2% of applicants, and those who entered endured 3 years of instruction so demanding that many cadets died before ever earning their wings. Those who graduated had already survived trials more dangerous than most combat operations. The survivors emerged as masters of their craft. By the time they stepped onto carrier decks or advanced airfields, they had logged more than 800 hours of flight experience, a staggering figure compared to the training of American pilots. Veterans of earlier campaigns in China often possessed over 0 hours. They had perfected the art of aerial combat, honed energy tactics that exploited the Zero's unmatched maneuverability, and carried the unshakable belief that their skill and spirit were superior to anything their enemies could field. Their combat record reinforced this confidence. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had transformed naval aviation from the opening strike on Pearl Harbor. At Pearl, in Malaya, in the Philippines, and across the Dutch East Indies, Zeros had humbled Allied fighters with alarming ease. In 1942, the aircraft achieved an extraordinary 12-to-1 kill ratio against Allied opponents. In engagements against British Hurricanes, American P-40 Warhawks, and F4F Wildcats, Japanese pilots consistently turned the tables through the Zero's ability to outmaneuver anything that took to the skies against it. Each victory confirmed the doctrine drilled into them, that spiritual strength, the warrior's Bushido spirit, could overcome technological shortcomings. This faith was not mere rhetoric. In battle after battle, Japanese aviators had proven it correct. Against poorly trained Chinese pilots, the doctrine worked. Against British forces flying outdated fighters, it worked. Against early American aircraft, it worked. Pilots emerged from these victories convinced that their way of fighting was not only effective, but invincible. To them, war was a proving ground of individual skill, where courage and maneuver were decisive. Then came the Corsair, and with it, a crisis of faith. At first, Japanese intelligence dismissed the new fighter as another brute, force attempt by the Americans to match the Zero with raw size and power. The Corsair's unusual shape, its long nose, massive propeller, and inverted gull wings only seemed to confirm this. Surely, they reasoned, it was another clumsy machine that would fall victim to the Zero's agility. But combat quickly proved otherwise. What shocked Japanese aviators most was not merely the Corsair's speed or climb, but the way its pilots used it. American flyers refused to be drawn into the tight, turning dogfights the Zero excelled at. Instead, they used altitude and velocity, diving through formations at speeds the Japanese could not follow, firing devastating bursts, and then soaring back to altitudes beyond pursuit. For the first time, Japanese pilots discovered that their most trusted tactics had been rendered obsolete. Their hard-earned skills, once decisive, now meant little against a machine that fought by entirely different rules. The psychological blow was immense. What had once been a contest of skill and spirit was now a contest of technology, and the Corsair made clear which side held the advantage. The first encounters with the Corsair left Japanese pilots unsettled, but as the technical realities of the aircraft became clearer, that unease grew into outright dread. The F4U Corsair was not simply another fighter. It belonged to a different category of machine altogether. Its design philosophy reflected American industrial might favoring raw power, survivability, and adaptability, while the Zero represented a pre-war approach that emphasized extreme lightness and maneuverability at the expense of protection. In direct comparison, the gap was staggering. At the heart of the Corsair's dominance was its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This 18-cylinder air-cooled radial monster produced 2,000 horsepower on takeoff, with water injection pushing that figure to an astonishing 250 horsepower in combat. By contrast, the Zero's Nakajima Saki 21 engine generated just 130 horsepower. This difference was not incremental, it was categorical. The Corsair's immense power allowed it to carry heavy armor, 6 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns, and large fuel loads while still outperforming the Zero in every measurable way. Speed was the most obvious disparity. The F4U could reach 417 miles per hour at nearly 20,000 feet, while the Zero's best variant in 1943, the Model 52, struggled to reach 351 miles per hour. In a dive, the contrast became terrifying. Corsairs routinely exceeded 500 miles per hour while retaining stability and control. Japanese pilots attempting to follow found their Zeros shaking apart. Above 360 miles per hour, the Zero's control surfaces began to flutter dangerously. Beyond 410, structural failure loomed. In such situations, pursuit was suicide. Climb performance reinforced the imbalance. The Corsair could ascend to 20,000 feet in just 7 minutes. The Zero, light as it was, needed nearly 11 minutes to reach the same height. Once above 25,000 feet, the Corsair remained responsive and deadly, while the Zero became sluggish and barely controllable. The Corsair's service ceiling reached nearly 37,000 feet, a realm that might as well have been outer space for Japanese pilots, whose aircraft struggled past 33,000. Firepower only deepened the nightmare. The Corsair carried 6 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each capable of firing 850 rounds per minute with a muzzle velocity of 840 feet per second. Together, they delivered nearly 70 pounds of metal every second, a storm of destruction that shredded anything caught in its path. The Zero, in contrast, carried 2 7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. In theory, the cannons could punch hard, but their ammunition was limited to just 60 rounds per gun, barely 7 seconds of firing time. In practice, Japanese pilots found themselves outgunned before they even had a chance to bring their weapons to bear. Just as devastating was the Corsair's survivability. Unlike the fragile Zero, the Corsair had 155 pounds of cockpit armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and armored oil coolers. Hits that would send a Zero exploding into flames barely scratched a Corsair. Time and again, American pilots returned to base in aircraft riddled with holes that would have been fatal in a Japanese fighter. For Japanese aviators, this resilience was demoralizing in the extreme. They realized they had to fly flawlessly, for a single mistake often meant death, while their opponents could afford to be aggressive, even reckless, because their aircraft could absorb punishment. The Zero had once achieved its legendary maneuverability by cutting every ounce of unnecessary weight, but the Corsair demonstrated that this philosophy had reached its limits. American engineers had simply built an engine powerful enough to overcome the weight penalty of armor and weaponry. The result was a fighter that could not only outperform the Zero, but also forgive its pilots' errors. Against this, the traditional Japanese belief that spirit and skill could overcome material weakness began to crumble. By the autumn of 1943, the Corsair was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming the bane of Japanese naval aviation. The crucible for this shift was Rabaul, the heavily fortified Japanese stronghold in the Southwest Pacific. Here, the Imperial Japanese Navy concentrated its finest fighter units to halt the relentless American advance. What they encountered instead was systematic destruction at the hands of the Corsair. When Marine Fighting Squadron 214, better known as the Black Sheep Squadron, arrived under the leadership of Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, the psychological balance in the skies had already begun to tilt. The Corsair had proven its ability to climb above the Zero, dive through its formations, and escape before pursuit was possible. Boyington, an aggressive and cunning commander, exploited these advantages with ruthless precision. On December 17, 1943, Boyington led 31 Corsairs to escort American bombers on a strike against Rabaul. The Japanese responded with 40 Zeros, piloted by some of their best men in their newest aircraft. The confrontation that followed demonstrated beyond doubt that the Zero was no longer the master of the Pacific skies. Boyington's Corsairs climbed to 25,000 feet, an altitude where the Zeros struggled to maintain control. When the Japanese tried to engage, the Americans dove through their formations at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour, fired short, devastating bursts, and zoomed back upward, leaving the Zeros floundering. The result was lopsided. 11 Japanese aircraft lost for the damage of only 2 Corsairs. It was not just the outcome that rattled the Japanese, but the method. Their pilots could neither close the distance nor escape. They were trapped in a cycle of helplessness, watching their opponents dictate every engagement. Once masters of the initiative, Japanese aviators now found themselves on the defensive, forced into survival rather than victory. The terror went beyond performance statistics. The Corsair carried with it psychological weapons as potent as its guns. Its distinctive shape, with its inverted gull wings, created a predatory silhouette easily recognizable in the sky. Its massive propeller and long nose gave it a brutal, almost menacing presence. But perhaps most chilling of all was its sound. The wing-root oil coolers produced a piercing whistle during high-speed dives, a noise so unique and unnerving that the Japanese soon nicknamed the plane Whistling Death. American pilots understood this psychological effect and exploited it deliberately. Corsairs often made diving passes over Japanese positions without firing a shot, using the scream of their dives to terrify ground crews and pilots alike. Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron added to the intimidation by painting shark mouths on their aircraft, emphasizing the predatory image. For Japanese pilots already grappling with an opponent they could not outfight, these psychological assaults deepened the sense of dread. By late 1943, conversations among Japanese aviators shifted. They no longer spoke confidently of victory. Instead, survival became the best they could hope for when Corsairs were in the air. The inverted gull wings that once drew curiosity now triggered instinctive fear. The hunter-prey dynamic had reversed, and Japanese pilots, once the hunters, were becoming the hunted. The technological superiority of the Corsair alone was enough to unsettle Japanese aviators, but when combined with the steady decline of Japan's pilot training program, it created a disaster from which the Imperial Navy could not recover. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators were among the best trained in the world. New pilots typically logged between 500 and 700 hours of flight time before seeing combat, emerging from an exhaustive program that tested both endurance and skill. This system created the seasoned masters who had humiliated Allied forces in 1941 and 1942. Yet war is as much about resources as it is about skill. By 1943, the cracks in Japan's system were widening. The relentless strain of combat, coupled with mounting losses, began eroding the ranks of veteran pilots faster than replacements could be trained. Fuel shortages, industrial bottlenecks, and the loss of training aircraft meant fewer flight hours for each new recruit. By mid-1943, replacements were entering combat with only about 150 hours of flight experience, barely a fraction of what their predecessors had enjoyed. By 1945, the situation had grown desperate. Some pilots arrived at the front with as little as 40 to 60 hours of total flight time. Against the Corsair, this was a death sentence. The aircraft was designed for aggression, and American pilots could rely on its resilience and power to forgive mistakes. Japanese novices, by contrast, flew fragile machines that demanded perfection simply to survive. Veterans who had once flown with confidence found themselves paired with green recruits who could not keep formation, much less engage effectively in combat. The traditional Japanese mentorship system, where experienced aviators guided younger ones in battle, collapsed under the weight of constant losses. Veterans were forced to watch their inexperienced wingmen die almost immediately when facing Corsairs, powerless to protect them. The psychological strain was immense. Combat that had once been a proving ground of skill now felt like an exercise in futility. Even the most seasoned pilots began to despair. They knew that the odds were stacked impossibly against them. Their machines were slower, their firepower was weaker, and their partners were untrained. To make matters worse, American training was moving in the opposite direction. By 1943, U.S. Navy and Marine aviators were arriving in the Pacific with over 600 hours of training, including hundreds in advanced fighters. They had studied gun camera footage, analyzed real combat engagements, and practiced high-speed tactics. Many had fired more ammunition in training than their Japanese counterparts would fire in actual combat. The contrast could not have been more stark. On one side stood American pilots, well-trained, well-equipped, and flying machines that combined speed, power, and survivability. On the other stood Japanese pilots, outnumbered, flying outdated aircraft, and increasingly unskilled due to rushed training. Against the Corsair, the imbalance was catastrophic. Encounters that once would have been contests of maneuver became one-sided executions. For Japanese veterans, the realization was devastating. No matter how skilled they were, their comrades were being thrown into a fight they could not possibly win. By 1944, the unraveling of Japanese naval aviation had become undeniable. The arrival of the Corsair, alongside other powerful American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat, ensured that the skies over the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. This shift reached its most dramatic expression in June of that year at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, remembered by American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was here that Japan's elite aviators confronted the full weight of American industrial and technological superiority and suffered annihilation on a scale that stunned even their enemies. The engagement unfolded as the U.S. Navy launched its assault on the Mariana Islands, a campaign vital for establishing bomber bases within striking distance of Japan itself. The Japanese responded with a massive effort, committing hundreds of aircraft from their remaining carriers and island bases to repel the attack. In the past, such a show of force had spelled disaster for Allied forces, but in 1944, the situation was entirely different. The Americans entered the battle with a new generation of fighters, many sharing the Corsair's powerful Pratt & Whitney R-2008 100 engine. Pilots now flew into combat with months of rigorous preparation, advanced tactical doctrine, and an overwhelming numerical advantage. The results were devastating. In a single day of aerial combat, Japanese forces lost between 400 and 450 aircraft. American losses amounted to just 130, most of which were bombers rather than fighters. Many Japanese pilots never even saw the American aircraft that destroyed them. Their Zeros, now underpowered and outclassed, could neither climb to intercept nor dive to escape. Against the Corsair and its counterparts, they were effectively blind and helpless. What had once been daring aerial duels had become one-sided slaughters. The psychological blow was immense. For years, Japanese aviators had believed in the supremacy of the warrior spirit, in the idea that skill and courage could overcome material disadvantage. But at the Marianas, this philosophy collapsed. No amount of bravery could offset the fact that their aircraft were hopelessly inferior. American pilots, many of whom were still relatively new to combat, cut through veteran Japanese formations with mechanical precision. The encounter stripped away the last illusions of parity. For the Corsair pilots, the battle confirmed what they already suspected. Their aircraft had tilted the balance of the war irreversibly. The Corsair's speed, climb, and firepower allowed American squadrons to dictate the terms of every engagement. Japanese pilots who tried to meet them head-on were torn apart. Those who attempted to evade were hunted down. The dominance was so absolute that American aviators began to describe combat less as a fight and more as a grim execution. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot marked more than just a tactical defeat for Japan. It symbolized the collapse of its air doctrine. The Zero, once feared across the Pacific, was now obsolete. The Corsair and its contemporaries had not only outperformed it in the air but had destroyed the very foundation of Japanese confidence. From this point forward, Japanese naval aviation would never recover. What remained of its fighter force would be spent not in pursuit of victory, but in desperate acts of survival and, eventually, suicide. While statistics tell one story of the Corsair's dominance, the experiences of the men who flew it reveal the depth of its advantage. American pilots quickly discovered that the Corsair turned aerial combat into something entirely different from what their predecessors had faced against the Zero. For many, flying the bin, wing fighter felt less like engaging in a duel and more like executing a process. Two men, in particular, Kenneth Walsh and Robert Hansen, embodied this transformation and demonstrated just how terrifying the Corsair had become for Japanese aviators. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh of Marine Fighting Squadron 124 became the first Corsair ace on May 13, 1943. Over the course of just 6 months, he achieved 21 confirmed victories, an extraordinary tally in such a short span of time. Walsh described his combat experiences with a candor that underscored the Corsair's superiority. In his view, engagements against the Zero had become mechanical. The formula was simple: climb above them, dive through their formation at speeds they could not hope to match, fire a devastating burst, then zoom back to altitude, completely safe from pursuit. Repeat the process until the enemy formation collapsed. To Walsh, the Corsair had made aerial combat unfair. The Zero's agility meant little when it could not dictate the fight. Japanese pilots, once masters of the dogfight, now seemed helpless as the Americans struck from above with impunity. Walsh himself admitted that the Corsair's advantages in speed, climb, dive, firepower, and protection transformed air battles into near certainties for American pilots. For Japanese aviators, each confrontation with pilots like Walsh was another painful reminder that their skills and courage were being negated by sheer technical superiority. If Walsh showcased the Corsair's consistency, Lieutenant Robert Hansen demonstrated its potential for extraordinary destruction. Flying with Marine Fighting Squadron 215 in early 1944, Hansen recorded 20 confirmed kills in just 17 days. Between January 14th and January 30th, he exploited the Corsair's advantages with such devastating effect that Japanese formations often scattered the moment they identified Corsairs approaching. His short but lethal career epitomized the psychological terror the aircraft inspired. For the Japanese, it was no longer simply a matter of fighting bravely. It had become a matter of surviving encounters that seemed unwinnable. Hansen's feats, coupled with those of other aces, revealed a broader truth. American pilots were not necessarily superior in individual skill to their Japanese counterparts. Rather, they were flying machines that multiplied their effectiveness. The Corsair gave even average pilots the ability to dominate seasoned Japanese veterans. In this sense, the machine had become more decisive than the man, reversing the entire philosophy upon which Japanese naval aviation had been built. For the Japanese pilots who faced Walsh, Hansen, and their comrades, the message was clear. Courage, training, and tactical doctrine could not overcome the brutal mathematics of speed, firepower, and survivability. Every encounter with the Corsair reinforced a grim truth. They were fighting not only against an enemy pilot, but against an industrial machine designed to erase their advantages and render their skills irrelevant. By 1944, the F4U Corsair was no longer just a fighter. It had become a versatile instrument of destruction that extended American air superiority into every corner of the Pacific War. What began as a machine designed to dominate aerial combat soon evolved into a multi-role weapon capable of hunting enemies in darkness, pulverizing ground targets, and striking ships with terrifying precision. For Japanese pilots and commanders, this transformation signaled that there was no sanctuary left, no realm in which they could hope to regain control of the skies. One of the most unsettling developments for Japan was the deployment of the F4U, a specially modified night fighting version of the Corsair. Equipped with the APS-4 airborne radar pod, these aircraft could hunt Japanese planes after sunset, a time once considered safe for operations. Darkness had long provided Japanese aviators with a refuge, a chance to regroup and reposition under the cover of night. But now, Corsairs prowled the skies even then, stalking targets invisible to the human eye. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots who had once relied on the cloak of darkness now faced the prospect of being hunted by unseen predators. The idea that an enemy aircraft could find and destroy them in total darkness shattered what little confidence remained. At the same time, the Corsair was evolving into a formidable fighter, bomber. The F4U variant could carry up to 4.0 pounds of bombs, more than some Japanese bombers, while still retaining superior speed and maneuverability. Armed with rockets and even napalm canisters, Corsairs could strike airfields, supply depots, and shipping with devastating effect. This expansion of roles meant that Japanese forces could no longer predict how the Corsair would appear. It might dive from the clouds as an interceptor, swoop low to strafe a column of troops, or unleash bombs on a fortified airfield. Its adaptability transformed it into a symbol of American power projection, capable of striking anywhere, anytime. For Japanese aviators, this versatility compounded their despair. It was one thing to face an enemy fighter in the skies. It was another to see the same aircraft destroying airfields, annihilating ground positions, and torching convoys. Each appearance of the bent wing machine reinforced the sense of futility. Even when Japanese fighters managed to avoid combat, they returned to find their bases in ruins, courtesy of the very aircraft they had fled from in the air. Japanese attempts to counter the Corsair with new aircraft, such as the Kawanishi N-1K George, showed promise on paper but fell short in practice due to unreliable engines and complex hydraulics. Modifications to the Zero, such as adding armor and self-sealing tanks, only stripped it of its agility without granting true survivability. In every case, Japanese engineers were playing catch-up against an opponent whose industrial base could mass-produce technological innovations faster than Japan could even test them. By late 1944, the Corsair's omnipresence made resistance seem pointless. Whether day or night, in the air or on the ground, it loomed as an inescapable threat. Japanese pilots increasingly accepted that they were no longer fighting for victory, but only for survival, or in many cases, for the chance to die with meaning in kamikaze attacks. The Corsair had not only beaten them in combat, it had stripped away the very possibility of hope. By 1945, the F4U Corsair stood as both a symbol and an instrument of Japan's defeat. Its kill ratio over 11-1 was staggering enough, but numbers alone did not tell the full story. More than any other aircraft, the Corsair embodied the collapse of Japanese naval aviation and the unraveling of a philosophy that had guided its warriors for decades. The Zero had once symbolized the supremacy of skill, courage, and the Bushido spirit. The Corsair demolished that belief, proving instead that industrial might, advanced engineering, and systematic training would always prevail in modern warfare. The final months of the war revealed the full extent of this collapse. At Okinawa, Corsairs flew over 15 0 sorties, claiming more than 500 aerial victories while delivering thousands of tons of bombs and rockets against Japanese positions. By this stage, many Japanese pilots sent to oppose them had fewer than 30 hours of training in total, barely enough to handle their aircraft, let alone face experienced American aviators in superior machines. Engagements often lasted only seconds. Survivors described being destroyed before they even had the chance to bring their guns to bear. For many, the Corsair's distinctive gull-wing silhouette in the sky meant not the beginning of combat, but the inevitability of death. It was during this period that Japan resorted to the desperate tactic of kamikaze attacks. Officially justified as acts of supreme devotion, these suicide missions were also a grim acknowledgement of reality. Conventional combat against Corsairs and Hellcats had become impossible. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of the kamikaze program, privately admitted that suicide was the only remaining option. Japanese aviators had been reduced from hunters to hunted, from warriors to sacrifices. In a cruel irony, their courage was redirected not into fighting for victory, but into accepting death as their only contribution to the war effort. The Corsair's legacy extended beyond its battlefield performance. After the war, Japanese officers and engineers toured American factories and saw firsthand what had made their defeat inevitable. Entire U.S. states outproduced the Japanese Empire in aluminum alone. American plants turned out more engines in a year than Japan could manufacture in fighters. The Corsair was more than just a machine. It was a product of an industrial civilization operating on a scale that Japan could not match. For the Japanese, it became a harsh teacher, demonstrating that spirit and skill were no longer sufficient in an age defined by technology and mass production. Even decades later, the Corsair's reputation endured. Restored examples flying at airshows still evoke awe with their distinctive whistle, the same sound that once made Japanese pilots' blood run cold. To those who faced it, the Corsair was not merely a fighter. It was the embodiment of a truth written in fire and steel. That courage alone means nothing when your enemy commands the sky. It forced Japan to confront the limits of its warrior code and paved the way for a national transformation from militarism to modernization. In the end, the Corsair did more than win battles. It destroyed an ideology, proving that in modern war, industry and technology, not spirit, determine survival.